I mix what I like, what I like.
Mix what I like is exactly where you want and need to be. I mix what I like organic, vegan, soul food from your immediate diet. Get healthy. Get healthy.
I mix what I like, what I like.
We're here on I Mix What I Like. You may check us out on imixwhatilike.org, where you can see all these other shows and what my daddy liked and other cool things.
Hey. What's up, world?
Hey.
Welcome to a special edition of I Mix What I Like right here on Black Liberation Media. Kamal.
What's up?
We're finally giving the people what they've really been begging for, man.
That's
me and
what
you.
I'm saying.
Me and you team up collabo. That's what they've been waiting for.
Watch,
You're welcome.
Watch. They've never been happier and/or more excited. You know what I'm saying?
I can feel it. I can see it now. The chat is must be just effervescent, beside themselves, ebullient. All right, look, first of all, I'm up way past my bedtime, so we need to get moving here. So big shout out to you, Kamal, for joining me. Big salute to the remixers who are here this evening. Please like, share, subscribe, support the platform, join the Patreon, do all of those things. Because by request, the people asked for it, and we are now going to be joined live and direct from China, Donald Trump's favorite place. By Ben Norton of Geopolitical Economy Report. Ben, thanks again for joining us. Welcome. Good to see you.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jared.
Hey, good to meet you, Ben. I just want good to meet you.
Oh, that's right. Had you all? Yeah, you two. Yeah. I didn't know you.
Never met. I followed your work. It's one of those like sort of media diets of like getting new information, newsworthy things I can use. Things I steal every now and then. And I just watched your 2-hour special on Brics and Brics Pay and all that kind of stuff. And I found it fantastic. And I was just like, yeah, can we get him on? Can we get him on?
So yeah, thanks. I've been following your work as well. So I'm happy to be here. It's going to be a good discussion.
Good.
Out of the gate, though, you said in this, if I heard you correctly, and I stop always at the headline. I don't do nuance. I don't really care. So once I hear something good, I'm out. And you said, I thought I heard you say Trump doesn't care about Africa. He's going to leave Africa alone. So Africa's good for the next 4 years. I said, so I turned off the podcast immediately and enjoyed the rest of my day.
Well, the other half of that I said is that, so in his first term, Trump actually never visited a single African country, which is pretty crazy. And you think about it in 4 years. And Trump, of course, made really racist comments. He said that, African countries are S-hole countries. So I said, if that actually means that his foreign policy is not going to be focused on Africa, that could be good for Africa. However, what it also means is that he's probably not going to do anything to the Africa hawks, especially, AFRICOM. We know that the U.S. military has U.S. Special Operations Forces active in more than 20 countries across Africa. And especially now in West Africa, there's this new federation of 3 revolutionary military governments in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And they kicked out the French, and they also have kicked out the U.S. troops. And Burkina Faso has nationalized its gold mines. Mali's in the process of also renegotiating contracts for gold exports. So, I mean, if Trump actually acts on that and doesn't prioritize Africa, that would be good for Africa, obviously. But again, it could also mean that he just allows the, neo-colonialists to do whatever they want because, again, Trump obviously personally doesn't care. And in fact, if you look at his Secretary of State, it has officially been announced now that it's going to be Marco Rubio, which is really bad news, especially for Latin America. Marco Rubio is a complete neocon, a complete imperialist. He's supported every major war in the past decade. He has supported many coup attempts across Latin America. He called for the U.S. to invade Venezuela. So the fact that he picked Marco Rubio, I think, shows that Trump's foreign policy is mostly going to be focused on China and also on Latin America, which, again, could be kind of good for Africa. But, I never expect the U.S. to ever have a good policy toward Africa. It's always a colonial policy.
Yeah, I got to remind myself to keep listening, to keep. Yeah. Kamal, is there somewhere you wanted to start or move to?
My big interest, or just to sort of set the tone, in terms of BRICS, it's been one of the most exciting developments I think has happened. And I know that the nations involved are, of course, different ideological persuasions, different systems of government, which constantly gets pointed out here when there's any media about BRICS. It's usually negative media to suggest that this is more of a sort of look-see thing, but there's not going to be any meat behind it. And it's a way for them to not treat it seriously. But the thing that I treat seriously, that is, despite the differences, the commonality, and I go back to Bandung Conference a little bit, is part of the commonality is that these folks want to get the Western yoke of empire off their neck and off their backs, and have the ability to begin creating alternative institutions, to begin trading without the threat of sanctions and so forth. So I think it's one of the biggest sustainable, potentially important developments in international affairs in some time. I think it's been around for approximately 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. So I still think it's relatively new in terms of what it's trying to achieve, the resources behind it, so forth and so on. But I want to start with a little bit before BRICS. One of the most important things to me about BRICS is that I want to get into is Brics Pay, right? The alternative system of accepting for international trade and accepting payments. And so I wanted to start digging in with SWIFT, actually, because I don't know what people know about SWIFT as the trading mechanism that most international trade goes through, and the control of it via Western nations, in particular the United States. And then I want to move a little bit into what Brics Pay potentially can be like as a payment system, and some of the other ways that folks are thinking about it. And then we can talk about currency, maybe some other things. But so my first real question to you is, if you could you give us a little history of the SWIFT system, what its use is, how it's been implemented, sort of the control mechanisms over it, and why it's become such a problem, particularly for nation states which have different foreign policy goals. And I'm being nice, of course, in terms of my my interview skills or whatever, who have different foreign policy goals than what the United States and Western Europe have. And the fact that these folks have been will be punished, of course, and have been punished by being kicked off of kicked off of SWIFT. And what's the importance of that for nation states in terms of their economy and their trade when they do get kicked off? So I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, great question. I'll answer it in a second. I just want to mention, you mentioned the history of BRICS. Really quickly, I'll go through. So yeah, BRICS was founded in 2009. It was originally BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And then South Africa joined in 2010. They became BRICS. And you mentioned, that they are relatively new, because even though they've existed since 2009, 2010, they at first were not really doing a lot. But in the past few years, especially with the proxy war in Ukraine and the trade war in China, BRICS has become much more active. And there are more than 30 countries around the world that have expressed interest in joining across the global south. And last year, in the meeting in South Africa, at the BRICS Summit, they expanded officially and they added 4 new members, which include Ethiopia, Egypt, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. And then now, as of this year in October, BRICS held another summit in the Russian city of Kazan. and they added 13 new partner nations. So these are countries that are in the process of joining. They changed the process because last year they had invited 2 other countries, including Argentina and Saudi Arabia. But Argentina at that time had a left-leaning government. They left power, and a far-right government came in, a very pro-US leader, Javier Milei, and he withdrew from BRICS. So they don't want to repeat that mistake. So now they've changed the process, and they have a temporary period where they wait a year and a country is a partner, and then they eventually join. So in this last summit in Kazan, Russia, they added 13 new partner nations, which is very important, including several from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. From Africa, they added Algeria, Nigeria, and Uganda. From Latin America, they added Bolivia and Cuba. From Asia, they added many countries, including some huge ones like they added Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. So BRICS is growing in influence. Even before this most recent expansion, BRICS already represented more than 1/3 of global GDP and more than 40% of the world's population and about 30% of global oil production. And now that they're adding so many new countries, I mean, it's very quickly becoming the majority of the world. So, there's this idea that has been used, this concept that's been used recently. Instead of the term global south, some countries have preferred the term global majority. And I think BRICS definitely represents the global majority, right? Now, to answer your question about SWIFT. So one of the main goals of BRICS has been trying to create economic alternatives. So you mentioned that, yeah, there are a lot of internal differences in BRICS. There have always been internal differences in these international movements. You mentioned the Bandung Conference of 1955. If you look at the countries that were brought together, they had very different systems. You had monarchies, you had revolutionary movements, very different. But they came together in common unity against colonialism. And if you look at the famous Bandung Declaration, you can see, for instance, there's no mention of economics. It's only a political statement. Whereas now we see with BRICS, it's actually the opposite. It's mostly focused on transforming the global economy. And before this most recent summit happened in Kazan, Russia, so every year BRICS has a rotating chair country, and this year Russia is the chair. So right before the summit this year, the Russian Central Bank and Finance Ministry published a 50-page report that details plans to transform the international monetary and financial system. And that was a report that was written in its capacity as the chair of BRICS, and it was endorsed by BRICS at the summit. So it's not just Russia that's behind this. This is their plan. It's basically their blueprint. And they have a lot of ideas, which I'll talk about in a second. But anyway, the point is that BRICS has really kind of made this its central issue. And that's why, yes, it's true that there are these political differences and the Western media loves to exaggerate them. But that's not really the point. They're not trying to unite in a political bloc. It's not like the EU or something. It's certainly not like NATO. And in fact, Putin said very clearly in his speech, he said, we're not seeking a military alliance or a bloc. We're not an alternative to NATO. Fundamentally, what they're trying to do is they have countries coming together, largely from the global south, all from the global south plus Russia. And, Russia was basically kind of kicked out of the West. So now they're part of this larger bloc. And what essentially they're saying is that we want to create new alternatives economically and financially, because the current financial order is one that was created by the Western colonial powers at the end of World War II, when much of the world was still colonized. Much of Africa and Asia were still formally colonized during the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 that established the international monetary and financial system with the dollar at the heart. And they're saying that we need a new system. We need a new framework. So among those institutions, as you mentioned, the SWIFT system. Now, this is an interbank messaging system. What does that mean? It means that when banks want to communicate with each other, when they want to send money and information about payments, how do you communicate? You use this technology, which is the SWIFT system. It's pretty old. It's pretty antiquated. It really needs to be updated. So it's not just a political problem. It's also a technological problem. But it's technically based in Belgium, but it's really the U.S. oversees it. And because the U.S. oversees it, it says that any country whose banks use SWIFT, they have to abide by U.S. sanctions policy. And then there's also, related to the SWIFT system, is also this problem in the existing monetary and financial order, which is that most banks, when they facilitate payments by companies between different countries, they end up communicating through what they call a correspondent bank. So to make it very simple, let's say like Brazil wants to trade with Indonesia, and if you're a Brazilian exporter and you want to export Brazilian iron ore to Indonesia, the Brazilian exporter has a bank in Brazil. The Indonesian importer, which wants to buy the iron ore, has a bank in Indonesia. How do their banks communicate? So the Indonesian importer can send money to the Brazilian exporter to their bank. Well, usually their banks have no connection. So this is not just about the SWIFT system. It's also about the correspondent, that is the third bank that is used to communicate between the two of them. So usually most of these banks around the world, they have a correspondent bank in the US, usually in New York. So for instance, I spend part of the time living in Nicaragua. I have a bank account in Nicaragua. In order to send money abroad, my bank account in Nicaragua communicates through like Bank of America or Goldman Sachs to another country's bank. Even within Latin America, by the way, this is how screwed up the system is. So if you're in Panama and you want to do trade with Colombia, and you want your banks to communicate, they'll probably do their transaction through a correspondent bank in New York, like Bank of America, maybe, or in Florida. Sometimes they have their correspondent banks in Florida. But the point is that the U.S. is at the center of all of the system. And because of that, Washington says that any transaction that goes through that system technically touches U.S. soil legally. That's what they claim, at least digitally, And then that means that that the U.S. sanctions law must be applied. So this is why the U.S. sanctioned Huawei, because they said Huawei was violating U.S. sanctions on Iran. Why should China care? Huawei is a Chinese company. Who cares about U.S. sanctions on Iran? China doesn't have sanctions on Iran. Well, it's because Huawei was using the U.S.-controlled financial system to process payments, to get payments from Iran. So then the U.S. says, we're going to sanction you. And then, of course, with the proxy war in Ukraine, the U.S. cut Russian banks out of the SWIFT system. The U.S. has cut Venezuelan banks out of the SWIFT system. So the point is that the entire structure of the financial system, the actual railroad upon which the financial structure was built to communicate, is controlled by the U.S. And then all of the correspondent banks used are almost always in the U.S. or sometimes in London. So this system needs to fundamentally change. BRICS is trying to create alternatives. And in fact, we've already seen several alternatives. Russia has created an alternative to SWIFT, and multiple countries' banks have joined. Iran's banks have joined. China's banks have joined. China has its own alternative to SWIFT. So what we're seeing is what even some mainstream economists have referred to as an increasingly multipolar financial order, in which basically there are going to be different kind of regional blocks of trade, which is how trade had been for thousands of years, right? You had trade mostly in different regions: Southeast Asia, East Asia, Africa. You have Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America. So you have these regions where most trade happens inside the region, and you're going to have new institutions. And that's especially true for Eurasia. So Russia and China have now become each other's largest trading partner, and 95% of their trade does not use the dollar. It uses their own currencies. Russia and India are trading in their own currencies. Russia and Iran are trading in their own currencies. China and Brazil are trading in their own currencies. So we're seeing a lot of changes. Mm-hmm. And of course, not all of this is being directly overseen by BRICS. BRICS is really a kind of loose umbrella in which all of these countries come together to collaborate. But many of these initiatives have been going on between different countries. And you can say BRICS is kind of the center of gravity that brings them all together.
So then what is, that was a great answer. So what is Brics Pay? And what is the relationship, or how is Brics Pay at least thought about? Like I understand at the recent summit in Russia, there was, some tests being done or some introductory usage of Brics Pay and what it should look like. And, and I think people were given certain amounts of money that they could spend through the system. What is Brics Pay supposed to do in relation to SWIFT? Is it a replacement? Is it an alternative? And then secondly to that, based, at least since last year, again, as somebody who's been excited about it, I've been waiting for information on when is Brics Pay starting or happening, or why don't they hurry up so they can shut down SWIFT? What, as far as what what is the timeline for even, and obviously there are very technical factors in this. You're talking about an international system. What is like a timeline for even a real world experience? And understand that there are other sort of subsets of SWIFT payment systems. What is a timeline for some new overarching Brics Pay system to even be attempted by nation states and or companies trying to get off of SWIFT?
Yeah, well, so Brics Pay, I think we could say, is kind of the beginning of one of these first experiments. So I mentioned that China and Russia have both created alternatives to SWIFT, but we're talking about different levels of financial operations, right? So Brics Pay is a way to facilitate actual payments involving what they would call retail payments, which means companies, average people. Whereas a lot of this, what they've been focusing on recently, is kind of the more like high level structure involving banks. So if you think about the financial system, you can think of many levels. At the top, there are the central banks. So how central banks can communicate with each other, which until recently, they can't really do it that much. But now there are new alternatives being created. Another system that's being developed is called mBridge, which is a way for central banks, including in many BRICS countries, to settle trade imbalances directly so they don't need SWIFT. So they can communicate. So the central bank, for people who don't know, is essentially the bank of the bankers, right? So we as individuals, we have an account at a bank, but then where do the banks, if I have an account at Goldman Sachs, where does Goldman Sachs have its bank account? Its bank account is at the Federal Reserve, the U.S. central bank. And this is true for people around the world, right? So the central banks didn't really have a way to communicate until recently. And that's what a lot of the focus has been on, because what a lot of these countries in BRICS are thinking about is, okay, when we're doing international trade, almost never when you trade, you almost never have a complete trade balance where I sell you, my exporters sell you $100 million of goods and then I import 100 million. No, it's usually we sell 100 million and then we import 200 million. So we have a trade deficit of 100 million. How do you settle that imbalance? What do you hold? Like, what currency do you hold that imbalance in? Is it held in dollars? Is it held in? So China and Russia are doing trade in their own currencies, in Chinese yuan and Russian ruble. So if China wants to buy gas from Russia, it can buy that gas in Russian rubles, right? But then let's say China has a trade surplus with Russia. Russia has all of these excess yuan. What can it do with the yuan? Well, it can hold on to them. It can maybe invest them in Chinese government bonds, which are denominated in yuan, or it can use those yuan to buy a lot of imports. China produces everything. So their importers can use yuan to buy Xiaomi phones and BYD electric vehicles and machine parts and whatever, right? So a lot of countries have been focused more on that because that's kind of the more immediate concern they have. And then you go below the central banks and you have the communication between banks, which I was talking about, like, the correspondent bank system. So that is also being resolved. And then you also can have retail people. So you have individual companies and people, people like you and me. Like, we want to do trade with someone. We want to buy something. We want to send someone money or on the other side of the world. How do we do that? Well, Brics Pay is a way of allowing that for retail purposes. And it's still being experimented with. But you mentioned that at this summit in Russia, they did finally announce that they're allowing retail users to use Brics Pay to facilitate payments, and it doesn't use SWIFT. So this is a really important development. And as you mentioned, they were giving people some money to buy like coffee or whatever. It wasn't a lot, but they were trying to encourage people to install the app on their phone, and it works. And even Venezuela, for instance, has now been using Brics Pay, and you can buy some things locally, but it's still pretty limited. So for instance, there are a lot of different levels where it's complicated. First of all, if you're like a company, if you're like a coffee shop, or if you're not set up with Brics Pay, like, how is someone going to buy a coffee from your coffee shop, right? Or like, if you're a bank and someone has a bank account at that bank, maybe, yeah, you can use the app, but is your app connected to the bank? Because how are you going to put your money in the app, right? Mm-hmm. So this is still very much in the early stages. And I mean, rightfully, a lot of people were excited, and I was excited to see that it was being experimented with, and the actual like retail users can finally use Brics Pay. But like I said, I mean, honestly, if you're thinking about it from the perspective of like the government of China or Russia or India, that's not really their high priority. Their main priority is focusing on trade and how they can basically de-dollarize their trade, and also how they can make themselves immune, or at least as much as they can. They can protect themselves from sanctions and from having their reserves seized, because that's really their priority. I mean, of course, they do care about like their own companies being to trade and stuff, but their fundamental goal, number one goal, is okay, we don't want to happen to us what happened to Russia. What happened to Russia in 2022 with the proxy war in Ukraine? The U.S. and the EU, they seized, they stole, you know, that they said we froze. It's their fancy way of stealing $300 billion of Russian central bank assets that were denominated in US dollars and euros. And, you know, the way like the international financial system works, it's like the central banks of these countries, they don't hold like a bunch of physical dollars in their reserves. Like, they don't have these, they have some gold in their physical reserves, but the vast majority of the reserves are actually just numbers on a computer screen for all banks around the world, for all central banks. So in reality, the Bank of Russia, the central bank, had like hundreds of billions of dollars of US Treasury bonds and European central bank bonds. And then they were held in the ECB, the European Central Bank, and they were held in the US Federal Reserve because they're not physical. They're just numbers. They're actually just like a unit of account on the screen, right? And then the US and the EU, the Fed and the ECB say, okay, that now belongs to us. And not only do they steal that from Russia, they're using the interest on that to pay Ukraine. So a lot of countries are saying, wow, they did it to Venezuela. They stole Venezuela's assets. They stole Iran's assets. They stole Afghanistan's assets. They stole Syria's assets. And now they stole Russia's assets. And a lot of countries are saying, Russia's a huge power. I mean, this is one of the biggest countries, one of the biggest economies. If at first when Venezuela did it, of course, they were a little concerned, but maybe they thought it would still be kind of limited. But then when they did to Russia, a lot of people said, this is, you know, crossing the Rubicon. We have to find some kind of alternative. So that's really their main priority.
Damn. Yeah, thank you for that, Ben. So there's a couple things that I would want to get to. One of them, I'll work backwards since you touched on it already a little bit, talking about China a little bit. In one of your recent broadcasts, you talked about some of the pending threats from Trump's administration. So, but I got to say, actually, I'm sorry, I got to interrupt myself. On the one hand, listen, my students all week have been blaming me for Trump's victory. So let me, I need a little bit of help here. First of all, why is it not my fault that Trump won? Let's start. That is, why is it the left and those who were critical of Kamala, who said we're not voting for her, we're being blamed, Black men are being blamed, Latino men are being blamed. And then as we start to hear of all of the pending drama coming from Trump, people are, I think, to some extent, rightfully being, you know, they're being terrified. And then part of the reaction is, well, Kamala would have made it so much better. Kamala would have taken us and the world in a different direction. To what extent are my students right to be targeting me this way this week? No, I'm just, but seriously. So what are some, you've talked about it, I think, brilliantly in one of your recent broadcasts as well. What are some of the similarities and differences in terms of what people should expect with Trump, and what would have been maybe better or different had Kamala been elected, or not, for that matter?
Yeah, well, I think we could confidently say that U.S. foreign policy is pretty much always consistent. In Trump, in his first term, he carried out the same kind of very imperialist, neoconservative foreign policy. In fact, the former CIA director, David Petraeus, famously said that there was more continuity than change under Trump. And we now see that, you know, Trump has brought on a lot of these neocons and war hawks like Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz. So, I mean, we can see that the foreign policy of Biden is basically the same. We can't forget that what Biden has done, Biden and Harris have done, is insane. I mean, backing a blatant colonial genocide in Gaza. Now the Israeli regime is saying blatantly that they're colonizing northern Gaza. They've ethnically cleansed all of the Palestinians. They're never going to let them return. And now they're saying that next year they're going to completely annex the West Bank. So Biden and Harris have been in office for 4 years. They gave Israel $18 billion. They gave it carte blanche to do whatever it wanted. Israel invaded Lebanon. They let it do whatever it wanted. The U.S. State Department said openly that they supported Israel, that they called limited incursion, which is a fancy way of saying invasion of Lebanon. So, I mean, it's completely hypocritical. A quick point about Trump's victory that I have not seen emphasized enough. Why did Trump win? He didn't really win in so much as the Democrats lost. Trump basically won the same number of votes he got in 2020. In 2020, Trump got 74 million votes. This year, he got 75 million. Basically the same. So what happened? The Democrats lost nearly 10 million voters. In 2020, Biden got 81 million. Kamala got like 72 million. They're still accounting a little bit more, but it's not completely final, but those are mostly the final numbers. So why did almost 10 million people not vote for the Democrats? Because the Democrats weren't offering them anything. On the contrary, the Democrats were saying, we don't want to give you anything because instead we want to run to get moderate Republicans. Chuck Schumer famously said this in 2016. He famously said, for every working class, blue collar voter we lose, we will win 2 moderate Republicans in the suburbs, is what he said. That's the Democratic strategy. It's been that for a decade now, going back to Hillary Clinton. We don't care about the working class, and we're going to try to win over what they call moderate Republicans, especially pretty, upper middle class, affluent white families in the suburbs. That's what they've been going after. So we're not going to do anything to help working class people. We're not going to do anything to help people of color. We're not going to do anything to help immigrants. I mean, she was running a deeply anti-immigrant campaign. Why would someone vote for Kamala was saying, I'm going to be tough on immigration, and she went to the border and all this stuff. If immigration is an important issue for a voter, why would they vote for her over Trump? I mean, if someone really cares, like they're really against immigration, they're going to go for Trump. It's such a stupid strategy. Kamala Harris was campaigning with Liz Cheney, a Republican, the daughter of Dick Cheney. I remember 20 years ago when rightfully all the Democrats were saying that, Bush and Cheney were Satan incarnate. I mean, they oversaw a horrific criminal invasion of Iraq, killing 1 million people, the war on terror, all of that. And now here we are where the Democrats are literally campaigning with the Cheney family. At a rally, Liz Cheney thanked Dick Cheney at a rally, Kamala Harris thanked Dick Cheney for endorsing her and thanked him for serving the country. And then you look at the economic policies, or the lack thereof, proposed by the Democrats. I mean, why were people so angry? Inflation has eaten away at wage gains. The Democrats say, well, look, wage gains have gone up, but look at real wages. Basically, real wages have not gone up because inflation has gone up at the same level. So people feel much poorer. An exit poll done by the Washington Post found that 67% of people said that the economy is worse off now than it was 4 years ago. And if you look at 75% of people who said the economy is the most important issue voted for Trump. Now, obviously, Trump has no actual solutions. I mean, he's a demagogue. Like always what the far right does, they propose false solutions. But at least in his campaign, he was talking about the economy. Kamala Harris's entire campaign was, we need to defend democracy. We need to defend our republic against authoritarianism. If you are a working class family and you're working 3 low-paid jobs and you don't have benefits and you're trying to put, food on the table for your family, and food is getting expensive and eggs are $10 or whatever, like you don't care about this whole rhetoric about democracy and saving the republic. Who is that appealing to? Again, they're trying to appeal to upper middle class people in the suburbs. Like it's just not. So the Democrats lost this election. And then that's not to mention, I mean, I would like to believe, honestly, that it was also because of the genocide in Gaza and the war in Ukraine. Certainly, I think that was a factor. For instance, if you look at Michigan, it was definitely a factor in losing Michigan, especially Muslim Americans and Arab Americans in places like Dearborn. And Kamala Harris sent a bunch of pro-Israel people like Richie Torres to go to Michigan, and Bill Clinton to go and to yell at people and say they have to support Kamala despite the fact that she's backing a genocide. I mean, so the Democrats, they were alienating their own base. And it's not a surprise that when you alienate your base, when you don't give them anything, when you spit in their face, I mean, people are not going to turn out. And that's why nearly 10 million people did not turn out for the Democrats. That's why Biden won, is because there was much more turnout in 2020. And of course, Trump was the incumbent. So the Democrats, they did, to be a little fair, they did inherit the problems of the post-pandemic supply chain disruptions and inflation. But, you know, there are some people who defend the Democrats and they say, well, in most governments around the world, incumbent parties that were in power during the global inflation shock after the pandemic, most of them lost power because voters punished them for the high inflation. However, there were some exceptions. And one exception is the southern neighbor of the US, Mexico. Mexico has a left-wing government run by the Morena party, first Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, and now Claudia Sheinbaum, who are very much from the left. And they have had a strong left-wing program, pro-working class program, massively expanding the minimum wage, expanding healthcare, expanding education. Poverty reduction has been very successful. Millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. And they, not only did they win re-election, they won re-election in a landslide, winning almost every single state in Mexico in the last election, which is this year, this year, or just a few months ago. So there's this idea that the Democrats, this is what they say, we were doomed, we had no option, we inherited this inflation, nothing we could have done could have saved us. But it worked for Mexico, because when you actually have a working class program that benefits most people, instead of just a bunch of billionaires, then you can win the election.
Wow. Yeah, no, thanks for that. And Kamal, if you don't have anything to jump in right away on that, let me ask if I can. You know, in similarly, in one of your recent broadcasts, you in talking about China and the claims, you played a clip, I think, of Trump saying he's taken jobs back from the rest of the world, and he's going to put all these tariffs on China. But then you asked a question that I will say I had crossed my mind, but not as laid out clearly as you did, which is, what is the United States going to do? So you said, is the U.S. going to put all of a sudden develop all these factories to produce shoes and iPhones, and who's going to do all of this? That in other words, what Trump is setting everything up for is an inflation, and you explained how it's in other words, he was just contradicting himself, causing more, making promises that don't make any sense, and then making promises that are going to negatively harm the consumer in the United States as cost gets passed on always down the line. Could you just say a quick word or two about that point? And obviously, I know you elaborate much more in your own extended discussion of that.
Yeah. So 2 quick points. First, so Trump, you mentioned this idea of taking jobs back. I'll talk about that in a second. And then also the point of tariffs. And the question is whether or not there'll be blanket tariffs or targeted tariffs. So start with this, like taking jobs back thing. So I mentioned that, the Democrats made no concrete economic proposals. Kamala briefly claimed that she was going to put price caps, or actually, let me take that back. She said they won't be price caps. She said that she's going to try to stop price gouging. And then the Republicans said, oh, so you want price caps? And she said, no, I don't want price caps. Well, so what is it? I mean, they were like, well, this is communism. You're going to have price controls. You know who famously put price controls on was actually Richard Nixon in the 1970s because of inflation. There was a big inflation crisis. So was Richard Nixon a communist? Well, it shows that actually Kamala's economic policy were to the right of Richard Nixon. But anyway, so getting back to Trump's proposal. So when you don't offer anything and the other side is offering something, even if it's crazy, a lot of people will vote for the alternative. So the point that I always stress is look at Brexit, right? Obviously, there was a lot of discontent in 2016 during the vote for Brexit in the UK. There were a lot of economic problems. There's a lot of inequality that has been growing and getting worse. I mean, Brexit didn't fix that. But the point is that you had two sides, two choices. You had a bunch of billionaires and neoliberals saying we have to stay in the EU. And then you have these people say we should leave the EU because they scapegoat immigrants, they scapegoat other countries like Donald Trump. And they say this is the alternative. This is the silver bullet. We're going to leave the EU and we're going to be prosperous again. Your paychecks are going to go up. Housing prices are going to go down. Obviously, that was false. But people said, well, the status quo isn't working for us, so screw it. We're just going to try to vote for change. And, Obama won promising change. Like, change is popular. Of course, he didn't bring change, right? But Kamala Harris's message was the exact opposite. It was not change. It was the status quo. It was everything is good. We want to save our republic from evil authoritarianism. So Trump said, I'm going to take jobs back. I'm going to take other countries' jobs. He literally said that in a rally. I'm going to take other countries' jobs. I'm going to take their factories. Now, I don't think he's going to do that. We'll talk about why I don't think it's going to happen. But if you're saying that to people in the Rust Belt who lost good manufacturing jobs, they're like, okay, let's go with this guy. At least he's going to try to bring back some jobs. Now, so I don't think that's going to work. Why is it not going to work? Well, let's get to the other part about tariffs. So in order to reindustrialize, the U.S. is facing this irreconcilable contradiction, which is that to reindustrialize, the U.S. needs to bring down the value of the dollar. Why do I say that? Because it's really, really, really expensive to make a factory in the U.S. And it's not, as neoliberals and billionaires say, it's not because workers are paid too much. It's not because they're all lazy. No. It's because everything in the U.S. is insanely expensive because the dollar is the global reserve currency, and capitalists all around the world want to store their wealth in U.S. dollar assets, which pushes up the value of the dollar. So when Trump won, if you look at the dollar in the foreign exchange market against other currencies, the dollar has massively gone up because a lot of people around the world are saying Trump's good for business, as they say. So we're going to invest in U.S. stocks. We're going to invest in different U.S. financial assets. And then the dollar goes up, right? And as the dollar goes up, it makes everything even more expensive in terms of other currencies. So that means that the U.S. has to import all of this stuff around the world. And as the dollar goes up, it makes it easier to import. So why would people make a factory locally if they can just import much cheaper goods from another country? It doesn't need to just be China. It could be India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Honduras. Like, as the dollar goes up, other currencies are by definition falling against the dollar, most of them. So then it's easier to pay for imports. So if you want to discourage imports, you have to bring down the value of the dollar. And that wouldn't necessarily hurt purchasing power of people in the US because your wages can go up. And if you're buying stuff locally, the price of that won't necessarily go up unless the price of the imports also increases. So this is really complicated. So like if you take China, for instance, China is an economy that produces everything and it imports very little. It mostly imports things like oil, gas, some food, but it produces everything. So if the value of the yuan, the currency, falls against the dollar, it doesn't really hurt people because you can still buy just as much locally because everything's made locally. However, if you want to buy an imported product like something from the US, I mean, what does the US even produce anymore? I mean, but let's say you want to produce something from the US you buy in dollars, then it becomes more expensive to pay for those imports. So if the US wants to reindustrialize, the short is that it has to take on Wall Street. But then look at Donald Trump's administration. It's full of people from Wall Street. His co-chair of his campaign is a Wall Street billionaire. We don't know exactly yet who's going to be his Treasury Secretary, but most of the names who have been floated are all hedge fund guys and Wall Street guys. Last time his Treasury Secretary was Steve Mnuchin, who was a Goldman Sachs executive. I mean, like, Trump is a billionaire. He's backed by Elon Musk, who's going to be in his government, who's the richest man on earth. He created this new ministry with Elon Musk, the Doge ministry, Department of Government Efficiency. Vivek Ramaswamy is going to be in it as well. Ramaswamy is a venture capitalist from Wall Street. Trump's vice president, J.D. Vance, is a venture capitalist whose career was started by Peter Thiel, another billionaire venture capitalist. So Trump has this insane coalition where he claims that he's going to reindustrialize, but he's surrounded by Wall Street guys who are not in any way, they're not going to devalue the dollar. They're not going to put capital controls on because that would hurt Wall Street. So it's just not going to happen.
And we see this truck, when Elon Musk finally gets involved with production, we see this whack ass truck that's breaking down and being recalled every 5 minutes. But just real quick.
Just quickly, I just wanted to, and the other thing that's happening, well, historically, with he'd be going up against the international capitalist order, right, which wanted to de-industrialize for cheap labor costs, first Mexico, and then moving to China, where China became, and everybody was happy with China, right? The capitalist structure was happy with China being the place where everything got made, particularly when they were low-end goods, right? And it wasn't a challenge, particularly around technology or high-end goods. And when China decided that in terms of how it would sort of redo its economy or upgrade its economy to even challenge around those things, that is when China became essentially the new boogeyman or the new enemy. When it decided it would no longer just be the place for low wage labor, but it would actually build a, relatively speaking, sophisticated, modern economic system based on, in some ways, some state enterprises where there would be more control over banks and how and resource flow and the rest of it. That is why China has become really the enemy of the United States. And you're right, like the rhetoric is something that appeals to working class whites who want their capitalism back the way it was in the 1950s and 60s. They want their America back. And that's the appeal of the Bannons and some of these other folks, is that their promise is that basically they're going to reintroduce capitalism as it was in the 1950s and 60s, where white Americans felt superior to black folks, and where, on an economic level, folks had pensions, to be honest. Folks could be one income families. Wives would stay home. And so this whole nuclear family setup is this harking back to what they consider the good old days. And that's what they're appealing to. But the capitalist order is not interested in that at all. They're not interested in going back to the good old days.
But that's what is
much money to be made.
But that's what I was hearing in your podcast, Ben, was so crazy, because as you just point out, he surrounded himself with all these non-industrial financier crooks whose worldview created this problem, because all of the industry and all the jobs that 1950s America was doing are now in China. So, but my one question, or in Latin America, but my one question is, one part that I was confused by in this is that I thought the argument would be that if tariffs go up on China, then the goods that are made there that come here, those prices go up. They get fewer, less of those items are purchased because of the price hikes, which gives room for other competitors and devalues or lessens the income going to China as a result, which would then hurt their labor force and make it even harder for them to buy products even in their own country that they don't need to import, but they still need to purchase using wages they got from making all the cheap stuff going over there that people would not be buying as much. So what am I missing in that? If the goal was to hurt the Chinese economy and actually raise tariffs, what am I missing in terms of why they wouldn't do that, or why that wouldn't be somewhat successful?
Great question. Yeah. I promise I will respond to that in 1 second. I just want to respond to something that Kamal said that I think you hit the nail on the head. When the U.S. deindustrialized in the neoliberal era, right, with outsourcing and offshoring in the 70s, 80s, going into the 90s, essentially the deal was that when the U.S. normalized relations with China under Richard Nixon in the 70s, and then when Clinton allowed China to join the World Trade Organization in 2001, at the end of 2001, essentially the deal was China would permanently be subordinated and would be the factory that would make low value added products that are very labor intensive for Western markets. So they would export them to Western markets, which would be also a way, it was kind of this grand bargain of the capitalist class, because wages have been stagnant in the West since the 70s, right? But people have not necessarily felt much poorer because there was a lot of deflation in consumer goods, because consumer goods and technologies became much cheaper because they were made in other parts of the global South. So even though your wages have been stagnant, you can buy iPhones and computers and whatever. And at the same time, all the stuff locally has gotten way more expensive. If you look at if you look at a chart of inflation and you look at housing, education, healthcare, they've all skyrocketed in the past 40 years in the neoliberal era. But then the cost of consumer goods has gone down massively. So there's deflation in consumer goods, massive inflation in the cost of living, which of course also explains a lot of the crisis going on in the West and the move toward the far right, because neoliberals have not offered an alternative. So one of the goals of imperialism is to maintain violently an international division of labor and to prevent countries in the global South from moving up the ladder of the division of labor toward more high value added forms of production where they can hold on to more of the surplus value their workers create, right? So capitalists want to make sure that workers in the global South are doing a lot of labor intensive, low value added products, making, clothes, making toasters. But then China said, no, we want to actually produce everything, including the most advanced technologies. We don't want to simply export everything to the West. We want to have our own higher standard of living for our own working class. And we want to compete in semiconductors, in electric vehicles, in the most high tech sectors. And then the US said, no, you're not allowed to do that. The deal was you would always be below us on the totem pole, and our corporations would maintain an intellectual property monopoly. So you would build the iPhones, but then Apple, as the owner of the intellectual property monopoly, would get the vast majority of the profits. Because if you look, Apple has this massive global supply chain, and each part of it, there are a few profits, but most of the profits in the supply chain are very small. The vast majority of the profits simply come with the intellectual property. That's what the goal of the US was. We're not going to produce anything, but we will design everything, and we'll own the intellectual property, and we'll suck in all those profits, being the owners of the intellectual property. So they're at the top of the international division of labor. China was supposed to be kind of in the middle. And then you have countries like Honduras and Bangladesh that are at the bottom of the division of labor, right? China's saying, no, we don't want that system. And that's why China is now a threat, right? China's saying that we refuse to subordinate ourselves, like Russia, by the way. I mean, when Putin came in, Russia originally was trying to integrate with the West. But then the West said, no, Russia will not be allowed to integrate on equal terms, only as a subordinate. And Putin, being a nationalist, said, no, we're not going to tolerate that. We want to be an independent, sovereign, strong country. So anyway, so that explains that. And the new Cold War that the US is waging, which is ultimately about subordinating China and reimposing this international division of labor in which the US is on top. And it sucks in all of the intellectual property profits. But getting back to this issue of tariffs. So, okay, Trump's magic bullet solution is that he is going to put huge tariffs on Chinese products, and that's going to incentivize people in the US to make factories to build products. That's not how it's going to work. In reality, what would happen is that the US would just import those products from another country, like Indonesia, like India, like Mexico. And now, because again, the costs of production are so insanely high in the US. Think about it. Again, it's not just because of wages. For instance, German workers have very high wages, but Germany is a major exporting superpower. Germany has a huge industrial base, although it's actually been destroyed in recent years. It's declining because of the war in Ukraine and the cutting off of Russian cheap gas and all of that. But Japan is a country that also has pretty high wages for their workers. And yet Japan is a major industrial power. So this idea that neoliberals say that if the US wants to reindustrialize, workers have to have low wages, that's not true. It's because of the cost of production and the cost of living. Because think about it, it's not just wages. Everything in the US is expensive. Transportation is expensive. Healthcare is expensive. Housing is insanely expensive. So why would someone make a factory in the US, given how high the costs of production are, when they can do it in another country that's way cheaper? Wages are only one part of that process of production. And then also look how bad US infrastructure is. It's falling apart. Bridges are collapsing. So why would they invest in the US? So Biden's solution is we're just going to give companies billions of dollars of free money in subsidies from the government, which is what he did to ASML. It's what he did to, different Samsung, to open factories in Texas and Arizona, ironically in red states. Brilliant strategy, Biden. Anyway, so then now what's happening is really a lot of this is being rerouted through Mexico. So the U.S. says, okay, Trump said, he started a trade war in China. We don't want these products from China. We're going to put tariffs on China. So instead what happened is that those products are rerouted through Vietnam and Mexico, which have been the two beneficiaries. So China's exports to the U.S. have gone down, but China's exports to Vietnam and Mexico have massively gone up. And then Vietnam's and Mexico's exports to the U.S. have also gone up. So you're just rerouting the exports. So now Trump says we're going to punish Mexico because we don't want China to simply reroute those exports through Mexico. Well, okay, so then they're going to find another country to do it. They'll do it through Indonesia. They'll do it through India. I mean, because at the end of the day, we have to deal with this contradiction. Capitalists are only interested in profit, and they're not going to open up a bunch of factories in the U.S. given all of the problems that I talked about. Tariffs are not a solution. Now, what I mentioned is that we can also distinguish blanket tariffs and targeted tariffs. So Biden has continued, by the way, Trump's trade war in China, but the Biden-Harris administration were more targeted. So they have targeted tariffs. They put 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, on semiconductors, on batteries, on solar panels, which, by the way, are all of the cheap technologies we need to transition away from fossil fuels. And the West say that, we want to move away from fossil fuels, which we need to do, obviously, because of climate change. But in order to do that, we need really cheap alternatives. And they just tariffed all of the cheap alternatives. And now our only option is like very expensive Teslas. Here's an example. I'm speaking in Beijing right now. If I go outside, I look outside, half of the cars or more are EVs already. They're everywhere you look. And now more and more, over half of the cars bought every year in China are EVs because they're so cheap. They're actually cheaper than ICEs, internal combustion engines, gas guzzler cars, because EVs are actually easier to make. The engines are much simpler. And you have companies like BYD, which a lot of people in the US don't even know about because there are no BYDs basically. BYD is actually the world's largest producer of electric vehicles. It overtook Tesla last year. And BYD, their entry-level car, the Seagull, they have an entry-level electric vehicle, like a small sedan, for like $11,000 US. And then you look at Tesla, it's like, what is it, 50,000 plus at least for the low-level models? So why would anyone in the right mind buy these insanely expensive, the BYD Seagull? I mean, so there are different models. Like that's like the really small one, but there's like a small one that's like kind of similar to a sedan. But anyway, the point is that like they're really cheap cars and they're good quality cars. And Elon Musk himself said in January on an investor call, he complained that Chinese EVs are extremely good. And he said, if we don't put some kind of protectionist measures, they will demolish other EV companies. And then a few months later, the Biden-Harris administration put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. So, I mean, whatever. The point I'm saying is that obviously they're hypocritical. There are all these problems. But the point I want to get at here is that is honestly not a crazy policy, even though I'm against it. Like, it's not crazy. If you want to have your own electric vehicles and you want to have more competitive EV producers, you can tariff Chinese EVs. And if you actually build up your own capacity, not just Tesla, but if you actually invest in other companies trying to make EV alternatives, that can work. Okay, fine. But but Trump said during his campaign, he wants to have 60. So by the way, but people are going to pay for more expensive EVs. That's the trade-off. Okay, you can build up your own domestic EV capabilities, but people are going to spend 4 or 5 times as much as they could spend on a BYD. Okay, so that's the trade-off. That's a form of inflation. Cars become more expensive. But then let's go to this idea that Trump has of blanket tariffs. He says he's going to put a blanket tariff of 60% on all exports from China. That's an insane policy. And that will, without a doubt, lead to very high inflation. Because, okay, if you have the targeted tariffs on EVs become more expensive. But you can find other alternatives. If you have 60% tariffs on everything that China exports, that's not just EVs. That's shoes, that's T-shirts, that's toasters, that's TVs, that's computers, that's monitors, that's TVs. All right, so where are you going to find all of the alternatives? Is the U.S. going to make a bunch of factories to make shoes and to make TVs? How expensive are US produced shoes going to be? They're going to be $300. I mean, so this idea that Trump has of blanket tariffs is not a solution. He likes to say, we're going to punish China. We're going to make, that's not how tariffs work. Tariffs are paid by US importers. And then that those costs go up. They fall on the shoulders of consumers. So in reality, they're either another country is going to replace China. So instead of buying those products from China, we'll buy them from India or buy them from Indonesia or wherever. Okay, fine. But it's not a solution for reindustrializing the US. All you're doing is replacing Chinese exports with another country's exports. And then if Trump says he's going to tariff Mexico as well, I mean, that's the largest US trading partner. Like, there is no simple solution to this. The only way of resolving this issue is you have to take on Wall Street. You have to massively reduce the cost of living and the cost of production in the US. You have to devalue the US dollar. And that means taking on Wall Street, taking on the financial class. It means reducing the cost of housing. And why is housing so expensive in the US? It's not just because, you have like the whole debate between the YIMBYs and the NIMBYs. Like, we want more houses, we want fewer houses, we need to build more. That it's not just that. I mean, that could have some impact on the margins, but the real reason is because houses have become a speculative asset for investors. Who is the biggest landlord in the US? It's Blackstone, which, by the way, the CEO of Blackstone, the highest paid CEO on Wall Street, Stephen Schwarzman, is what funded Donald Trump's campaign. So Blackstone, this private equity fund and alternative asset manager on Wall Street, they have 300,000 rental units in the US. So housing has become a financial asset used by people to hold their wealth. Not only rich people, but even, average people. They say it's a nest egg, right? This is common advice that parents tell their kids. Buy a house because it's a good investment, because the idea is that the value of the house will always increase. It can never go down. Well, if the value of a house always increases and it can never go down, how are young people, working class people, going to buy a house? You have to pick one. Do you want housing to be more affordable for people, or do you want the value to always increase? And then you have all these billionaires who buy up hundreds and thousands of properties. So the point is that you have these two contradictions. They're an irreconcilable class conflict. You have to pick one side. Donald Trump is surrounded by billionaires on Wall Street. So I do not think at the end of the day he's going to succeed in reindustrializing, because he would have to go against Wall Street.
But I was just asking if, but what if he doesn't care about reindustrializing and just wants to punish China a little bit? Wouldn't the tariffs kind of do that much at least? Anyway, it doesn't.
Well, I will respond very briefly. I know I give long answers, but
no,
briefly.
I mean, yeah.
So yes and no. It would probably mean a massive decline in Chinese exports to the US, but then again, they'll just be rerouted. So Chinese companies will invest in Mexico or Vietnam, and then they'll export the same products to the US, but they'll say made in Mexico or made in Vietnam. That means that the Chinese companies lose a little bit, and Vietnam and Mexico actually, they benefit from that.
But as you said, it's the importers that still pay the cost, not. So China still gets its money because the importers pay the cost of the tariff.
If they're a Chinese product, but then what would happen is that what has been happening in recent years is that, let's say you have a Chinese company like Lenovo, which is one of the world's leading producers of computers, right? Laptops. So let's say that there's blanket tariffs of 60% on all of Chinese products. So Lenovo recently opened a factory in Mexico. So instead of making the computer in China and then exporting it to the US, Lenovo opens a factory in Mexico. They make the laptop in Mexico, and then the product says made in Mexico, and then they ship it across the border, and the US has a free trade agreement with Mexico. So there are no tariffs on that laptop because it says made in Mexico, not made in China.
And that's why they were trying to punish
Trump
Mexico.
But then Trump says we're going to tariff Chinese products made in Mexico. Okay, so then what happens? China reroutes all of those exports. Those exports go to other countries, and then another country exports products to the US. It doesn't help reindustrialize. All you're doing is rerouting trade. So China's largest trading partner is no longer the West. It's actually Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries. And if you look, the BRICS countries, it's a gradual change. This doesn't happen overnight, but over the years, the BRICS countries have been doing more trade with each other, and China's trade now is more with the global South than with the West. And its trade with the West is declining, and its trade with the global South is increasing. So all Trump will do is just reroute trade. And China, in the short term, will have disruptions to its trade, but it's not like no one's going to trade with China anymore. People are going to be like, yeah, give us the cheap laptops. We want them.
Yeah.
And isn't that period over, basically? I mean, the attempt to isolate a nation like China is now the second largest economy. I think there's still predictions that in 20 or 25 years, it'll be GDP-wise the largest economy. Like the West or the United States in particular is still looking to isolate a nation like China and the global majority, as you stated. And so that's why, for me, BRICS, again, becomes so important, because as the West tries to control the rise of other manufacturing giants or other economic models, what seems to be happening, in my estimation, is somewhat of a decoupling in some ways of the type of economy, the world economy that particularly the West worked so hard to establish when it was in their favor. And so what do you see, like again, these right-wing governments with these sort of neocon theories of controlling China, of controlling other nation states from becoming either larger nation states in terms of economic or military. What do you see, particularly around the economic sphere? Do you see a decoupling of how no more world economy, or like as everybody's connected, or is there no opportunity or no way in which you go back to that anyway? Or do you see something that there is a sort of balancing act between an economy based on sort of a Western prerogative of how things should go, and a world economy based on a BRICS alternative of like what economic development starts to look like?
Yeah, well, I think what we're going to see is not the end of globalization. So I'll briefly say that globalization is a term that it's really a loaded term. It has a lot of different meanings. So in the West, a lot of people rightfully, they associate globalization with neoliberalism. So you can call it neoliberal globalization, outsourcing, deindustrialization, the lifting of protectionist measures, lifting of capital controls. That's all true. But globalization is also not just that. Globalization has existed for thousands of years. You could say that, the original Silk Road was a form of globalization, international trade, building supply chains. So what we're going to see is basically a different kind of globalization. I would say we're seeing the end of neoliberal globalization, where even the heart of neoliberalism, the US, is returning to protectionism after, for decades, preaching free trade, in scare quotes, and telling other countries, you're not allowed to have tariffs. So, for instance, every single industrialized country has industrialized through protectionism, including the US. Ironically, this goes back to Alexander Hamilton, who was an arch protectionist. And the whole idea was you have to develop infant industries. This is what Europe did. It's what the US did. It's what South Korea and Japan did. None of them followed a free market model. The free market propaganda is always used by the dominant imperial power telling other countries to implement free trade. So where free trade originally came from? The British Empire. So the British Empire was one of the most protectionist economies in the world. They protected their own textile industry and manufacturing. They colonized India. They destroyed India's manufacturing and textile industry, and then they exported their own products to India. And then they sucked it up all of the wealth. And the Indian economist Utsa Patnaik has estimated that $45 trillion of wealth were siphoned out of India during the British Raj, during the British colonialism. And then that wealth was used, by the way, as capital to invest in the colonization of the Americas, of Australia, of South Africa, of the British settler colonies, right? So
I'm sorry, what was that figure again? What was that
45
figure?
trillion.
45 trillion. Yeah, checking.
That comes from the Indian economist Utsa Patnaik, who's a very well-respected economist, that in nearly 200 years of British colonialism, and again, that wealth was used to industrialize the settler colonies, and then also with the slave trade and all of that. So it was colonialism and slavery that led to the primitive accumulation that established these wealthy economies, right? So anyway, the point is that with the British Empire, it colonized these countries, and then it told them to implement free trade. So literally, free trade began as a narrative for the British colonies, telling the colonies, you have to implement free trade to trade with us. It's like the U.S. telling Honduras, you have to have free trade with us. How are Honduran companies going to compete with U.S. monopolies? There's no way ever. It's going to destroy all of Honduras's manufacturing potential, which is exactly what happened. I mean, it didn't have that much. But the point is that like the dominant imperial power preaches free trade. And then when it no longer benefits, it returns to protectionism, which is exactly what has happened in the U.S. You know, starting in Reagan and going into Clinton and Obama, they all were talking about free trade, the free market. That's no longer the narrative. And it's bipartisan. You know, Trump is definitely a protectionist and Biden is a protectionist, right? So now that the U.S. no longer benefits. So what we're seeing is a kind of new form of globalization where essentially it's kind of more regional globalization. So obviously the U.S., like I said, it's not going to reindustrialize unless they take on Wall Street, which is not going to happen. So what's going to happen is you're going to see basically a form of globalization where you have kind of regional blocks of trade networks and supply chains. So the U.S. says we don't want China to be involved in our supply chain. So they're going to reroute it through a bunch of different third countries and fourth countries, and they're going to go all around. And then they're going to, extract the cobalt from, from Indonesia or from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then they're going to extract the nickel from Indonesia. And they're going to get the lithium from, Argentina. And then they're going to send it all through their complex supply chains. And they're going to try to go around China. So they're just going to remake the supply chain to try to cut out China. But at the end of the day, it's not like the U.S. is going to bring back all of these jobs and big back factories in the U.S. like Donald Trump says he's going to do. It's not going to happen. Now, you mentioned something important, Kamau. Now, there are a lot of people who say that China is the second biggest economy. And I don't blame you at all for saying that because that's what all the media says. But this is actually BS. China has been the biggest economy since 2016 or 2017, according to data from the IMF. What those neoliberal economists are doing and the financial media is doing, of course, they have this whole narrative. The U.S. is still so strong. It's the biggest economy. That's only if you use existing exchange rates, the current exchange rates of the U.S. dollar, which, as I've talked about, the U.S. dollar is way too overvalued. It's very expensive, which helps Wall Street and hurts average people. It's only beneficial to average people if you want to go travel, right? So like a lot of people recently have gone traveling in Japan or they've gone on vacation in Europe because the value of the euro has fallen a lot against the dollar and the value of the Japanese yen fell a lot against the dollar. So if you took a vacation to Japan, you were like, man, everything is so cheap here. Whereas in the 1980s, the Japanese yen was really, really overvalued against the dollar after the Plaza Accord in 1985. And there was this huge bubble in Japan and it was insanely expensive. And the joke people would make is if you went to Tokyo, you would have to take out a loan to go to dinner because everything was so expensive. If you made your income in dollars, but you were paying for things in Japanese yen, what happened? What was the result of Japan massively overvaluing the yen? The U.S., the Reagan administration forced Japan and also Germany to overvalue their currency against the dollar because Reagan wanted to bring down the dollar like Donald Trump does. So what happened is that it caused a massive bubble in Japan, like an epic bubble of proportions we haven't seen really in modern history, where, for instance, the famous statistic given is that in Japan in the late 80s, the value of the land upon which the palace in Tokyo, the old imperial palace was built, that land was worth more, technically in scare quotes, it was worth more than all of the property in California. I mean, an insane bubble in Japan. And then that bubble popped in the early 90s. And Japan has never really recovered from that bubble. This is what happens when you have a really overvalued currency. You have all these capitalists who are trying to invest in your assets because they think they can, get richer. So that's what happened in Japan. But the reason that it hasn't happened, the bubble hasn't burst yet in the US is because the dollar is the global reserve currency. Everyone wants the dollar. But as countries de-dollarize, and now Trump is also threatening countries that de-dollarize, he says he wants to put 100% tariffs on countries that drop the dollar. You can say that that's just a threat he made during his campaign, but if you pressure countries to de-dollarize, it's actually going to incentivize them to move away from US dollar assets, which is the only reason this entire bubble can stay afloat. And right now, the value of the US stock market in the US is 200% of GDP. It's a massive bubble. It's crazy. And by the way, you see a lot of billionaires cashing out. They're selling their stocks. In fact, we see that that Jeff Bezos has been selling tens of billions of dollars of Amazon stocks because they can see that, this bubble is really unsustainable. So China has the biggest economy in the world because if you measure China's economy in dollars, it looks like the second biggest economy. But if you actually use a separate measurement, which is a much better measurement, which is known as purchasing power parity, which actually measures the purchasing power of your currency. So if you get paid in yuan and you go out and you want to go to a restaurant or you go to the store and you want to buy something, how much can you buy with that yuan? You don't need dollars because nothing is priced in dollars here. If you account for the purchasing power of the Chinese currency, China's economy has already been the largest in the world since 2017, according to the IMF, and it continues to grow. And now, according to the most recent IMF data from October, China's economy is 20% of the entire world, and the US economy is shrinking. It's about 14% of the world and shrinking over time. So the reason that the US economy looks so big is precisely because of what I was talking about, because everything is insanely overvalued and insanely expensive, which does not help average people because, okay, a house, an apartment in New York costing $3 million does not benefit an average person because they can't afford it. It only benefits rich people who invest in those assets, and they want them to continue going up and up. So eventually that bubble is going to pop. And the question is, when the bubble pops, will the US government actually find a way to have a more level playing field that has a more balanced economy in which, healthcare is not 18% of GDP, and healthcare is not, it has the worst results in the world, but it's the most expensive, in which no one can afford a house because a house is a speculative asset? Or are they going to do what China has done, which is, President Xi has said, houses are for living in, not for speculation. And China popped the real estate bubble. And a lot of rich people have been complaining because their wealth has fallen. If you look out of all the countries in the world, the country where the number of billionaires is falling the fastest is in China, because they said, yeah, we don't care about, we allowed some people to get rich while we were developing. We're now pretty developed. And now the goal of China is, as the government and the Communist Party has said, their number one goal is common prosperity. That is more equality. Their previous goal, starting in the 80s until 2017, when they changed their priority, the previous goal was what they called developing the productive forces, developing as quickly as they could, developing industry, industrializing, developing infrastructure. They now have the world's best industry and best infrastructure. They're reprioritizing and moving their economy toward reducing inequality, raising living standards of poor people. They've ended absolute poverty. So if the US actually had that kind of transition, we had a government that could do something similar, that would benefit people. But if you look at everyone, of course, not just in the Republicans, but in the Democrats as well. I mean, Kamala Harris was campaigning with Mark Cuban, a billionaire. Joe Biden, during his presidential campaign in 2015, he told a bunch of rich donors in New York, he said, if I win, nothing will fundamentally change. No one's living standards will change. He was right about that. So, I mean, that's the moment we're in. Like, again, it's irreconcilable. Someone has to lose out. Either the billionaires lose out or working people lose out. And we've seen that the US policy for decades has been to hurt working people at the expense of billionaires who have gotten richer and richer. And that's precisely why billionaires get richer. Because what are the assets that billionaires have that make them richer? It's assets in the stock market, it's stocks, and it's government bonds, and it's real estate. So if real estate falls, by definition, the rich get poorer, but it also makes it more possible for working people to actually afford a house. So who's going to win? Who's going to lose? I think we can kind of predict pretty well who it will be.
Look, on that note, I have to go put down some young kids, my babies. Ben, it has been a pleasure to join you today. And I've looked at the chat and people are saying that you're my new Noam Chomsky, which means you're my favorite white man. And I must say you are well on your way to being my favorite white man. I really appreciate all your knowledge.
Congratulations, Ben.
Yeah, that's a high honor. That's a high honor, my man.
Thank you. It means a lot.
Thank you so much for everything that you've been contributing, not only recently, but over the years, man. You're a real gift to left intellectual thought, and I really appreciate your time. I'll let you guys continue. You take care.
I appreciate it a
Thanks,
lot. Thanks.
Kamau.
Thanks. It means a lot.
Ben, how was your time, by the way?
Yeah, we can go a bit longer. I'm not in a rush.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I do have a couple more questions, and if folks have anything in that they want Ben to respond to, please go ahead and put that in the chat or recycle it. One quick question I have is, did I hear you correctly say in a recent broadcast that this was the first election, the first U.S. election where more people registered independent than Democrat? Did I hear something to that effect on your?
Yeah, Reuters reported that it was the first election where the largest group of voters were self-identified independents. They were actually tied with Republicans, but they're tied for the largest group. So in this election, if you look at turnout, 34% of voters said that they were independents, 34% said they were Republicans, and only 32% said they were Democrats. So that's a huge shift.
Yeah, that's almost sounds like good news. And if China's really doing that well, just let them know if they need another disaffected Black Studies professor, tell them to holler. I will happily come over and help them catch up on some of that history as well. Speaking of which, it was interesting. I had a chance to speak to students at Georgetown University yesterday, which was a very different audience for me, and a more affluent and almost exclusively white class. And I was asked, what did I think of reparations? And my first, just to keep it somewhat short, my reaction was, well, it would require at minimum 2/3 of this country to vote to specifically redirect funds in this country to Black Americans. And how many of you in this class would do that? And everybody shook their head no. Like, everybody was like, I'm not voting for that. So one of the questions I did want to, but not that I'm not asking you to talk on that per se, but I am interested in your thoughts on, because the context of the conversation was, well, what does an oppressed community do in the United States now, given where things are? And from your vantage point, what do you have as a recommendation to any internally colonized or oppressed community within the United States, within this empire? Yeah, I'm just curious what your thoughts on your suggestions to any oppressed community here in terms of what you see happening in the world that they might do to improve their condition or seek unity with others. I don't know. Yeah, just anything that you might think. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, well, obviously form organizations, organize your community, form revolutionary groups. I think that's very important. But even more concretely and kind of less sexy of an answer is also that, local governments, it's not sexy to say, especially for, people who are interested in revolutionary politics, but local governments do have economic influence over the communities that they govern that can have positive benefits. And it sounds cheesy, but getting some local power, you're definitely not going to challenge the empire, you're not going to challenge Wall Street, but it will allow you to at least have some concrete measures that can benefit local communities, especially, Black communities who have been so routinely ignored, and if not ignored, attacked by local governments and local police, and ignored in local business policy. If you look at a lot of local governments, almost always their economic policies are designed by the local capitalists, the local elites, right? They come in and they decide this will be good for the real estate developers, and they ignore working class communities, especially Black and Latino communities. So, I mean, this is why I'm pretty sympathetic to people who, even who try to support, Black owned businesses, and sometimes on the left, people call them, Black capitalists and stuff. Obviously, it's complicated because you do have internal contradictions where you sometimes have Black capitalists who exploit other people in their community, right? So there are a lot of those internal contradictions that have to be worked out by the community. But I do think that, it's sometimes too easy on the left, especially like for white leftists, just to like write that all off and say that it's all just bourgeois politics. And it's not the solution to the problem. Again, the solution to the problem is we need fundamental radical change, revolutionary change of the entire government itself, the federal government and the system and the country and the structure. But I mean, like at the local level, local governments do have resources. And I think that like being able to use some of those resources to try to help communities can work. We've seen like attempts with that in Philly. It didn't really go super well, like but with like the attorney general in Philly and stuff. But I mean, my focus is more on geopolitics, so I don't have really
I was
good.
just curious. Yeah, I got you. I hear you. I appreciate it. I was just curious. So one person did get to where I was gonna. I think it was Brittany. It said, that the solution is to buy Bitcoin. What is, given what you've said about de-dollarization or the attempts or the claims to the attempts, one of the things we have heard from the crypto community has been that that's good. Let the dollar lose its power. Will come Bitcoin. It's been even promoted to the formerly, I forgot even what you said. The Global South has a new name, preferred name, but anyway,
Global majority.
the global majority, right? It's been promoted to the global majority as a solution. What are your thoughts about crypto and maybe what will happen with it in its regulation with Trump coming in now?
Yeah, really good question. I will say that crypto itself is kind of a misleading term. Cryptocurrency it's not really a currency. Bitcoin is almost never used. Like 1% of transactions are used for, or 1% of people use it for transactions. It's a speculative asset. So Bitcoin is seen as an investment, like a stock, like a bond. And in reality, if you look, Bitcoin is already very heavily concentrated in a few hands. So you know who has the biggest Bitcoin fund on earth? It's BlackRock. BlackRock has a $20 billion crypto fund, which an ETF, which actually is much bigger now. When they started, it was 20 billion, but Bitcoin has gone up massively recently. What they call the Trump trade. So you can't outcompete Wall Street. Wall Street has been firmly in charge of the Bitcoin industry now. I mean, like the Bitcoin market, if you will. And it's not like this decentralized thing that it was portrayed as. It's been incorporated into Wall Street. And you even now have, for people who don't know what an exchange traded fund is, an ETF, which basically is a way of abstracting Bitcoin even further. So instead of directly buying Bitcoin and holding it on an exchange, we saw what happened with FTX, which collapsed and they defrauded their customers. So instead of like buying Bitcoin and holding it on an exchange, which is risky, instead you can they securitized Bitcoin as like a financial security, and you can buy partial ownership of Bitcoin that are held by big asset managers on Wall Street, like BlackRock. So you can go through iShares, which is BlackRock's ETF manager, and you can buy partial ownership of Bitcoin through BlackRock. And that's the future of Bitcoin. It's a financial asset. People are calling it digital gold. And I mean, it's not necessarily worse or better than any other kind of financial asset, but it's not a currency, and it's never going to be used for a currency. Now, that's different from crypto as an idea. I'm actually not against crypto as a concept, because there are countries experimenting with crypto and actual other cryptocurrencies that are not just used as some kind of speculative asset. And by the way, I should point out that, crypto has been exploding recently. It's in a really big bubble, but I would urge people to be very, very careful. I talked about how we're in a big bubble right now. The S&P 500 has been skyrocketing. It just hit over 6,000. I mentioned that the US stock market is at over 200% of GDP, and billionaires can see that this is very uncertain. It's a very dangerous situation, which is why a lot of them have been cashing out, including Warren Buffett, one of the most powerful billionaire oligarchs. He's sitting on $325 billion of cash. He refuses to invest it in the stock market because he sees it as a bubble. And when the billionaires when they're doing that kind of thing, we should follow very carefully and not fall for like the attractiveness of these bubbles. Why is Warren Buffett hoarding money? He's hoarding money because he can see that the stock market is very, very overvalued. So if you look, for instance, one of the ways, there are two main ways to measure how overvalued the stock market is. One of them is what's known as the Buffett indicator, which is basically the stock market's value to GDP. So GDP is all of the goods and services produced in the economy, and the stock market's value is over 200%, which is the highest level it's ever been. So in 2000, there was the famous .com bubble. You had pets.com and all these companies that were kind of fake, and they all exploded, and there was a big bubble. At that point, I think it peaked around 160% of GDP. So we're in a bubble now that's even bigger than the .com bubble. It's very dangerous.
Oh, damn.
So I would be very careful. And this is why Warren Buffett says, I'm not getting involved. He's instead just parking his money in short-term treasury securities, which are paying, 4 to 5% interest. So I mentioned that even Jeff Bezos has been selling tens of billions of dollars of Amazon stock because he sees that I think he can see that the stock right now is really overvalued, and the stock market is probably going to fall. I'm not necessarily saying that it's going to be like a 2008 style financial collapse. What I am saying is that it will probably be a bubble bursting that is more similar to 2001. There was a recession in 2001, and some people blamed it on 9/11, but it was not because of 9/11. It was mostly because the .com bubble burst in 2000. So I think we'll see something similar to that. And so I'd be very careful to not lose a lot of your money in the stock market. And Bitcoin is in a similar bubble right now. So that's why Warren Buffett, who has all this money, he's saying, I'm not going to invest in stocks. The other way of measuring how overvalued stocks are is what's known as the PE ratio, which is basically earnings to the price to earnings. So how much the net income of the company, the profits of the company divided by the share value. And essentially, right now, most stocks are very, very expensive if you look at the PE ratios. So the point is that the stock market's in a big bubble. And of course, if you look at Bitcoin as a speculative asset, it follows basically gold. So when you have very loose monetary policy and expectations of inflation, it tends to go up a lot in value because it's seen as an inflation hedge like gold is. That's why I call it digital gold. But the difference is that gold has been used for thousands of years to settle trade. I mean, I'm not a gold bug. I don't think currency should be based on gold, but I recognize that gold is a legitimate asset that has been used for thousands of years, and gold's not going anywhere. Gold is held by central banks around the world. Governments around the world use gold. So that's a legitimate asset. Bitcoin is not. I mean, it's a speculative asset. Be very, very careful. As for other forms of crypto, though, like I said, I think there are interesting applications. The Venezuelan government created its own cryptocurrency, which is actually a currency. They call it the petro. And the value of it is backed by the value of a barrel of oil. So it's basically a currency whose value is backed by something tangible. Unlike Bitcoin, it's not backed by anything. It's just a speculative asset. And Venezuela has tried to encourage that for local purchases and has thought about trying to use it for trade internationally, although it hasn't really worked out internationally. And other countries are experimenting with using crypto. Russia, for instance, not Bitcoin, but because Bitcoin is not backed. The whole point, like Bitcoin is a libertarian political project, right? There are some people who even think that the CIA created Bitcoin. I'm agnostic. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I don't know. But there are some shady questions about the man Satoshi who supposedly created Bitcoin, whether or not it's actually a man, whether it's not an individual or a group or who knows. No one knows. But the point is that Bitcoin, the whole point of it is it's not backed by anything. It's not backed by a central bank or a government. It can't be issued by anyone. Whereas there are governments that are experimenting with creating cryptocurrencies that they could use for getting around sanctions. And this is also related to, I mentioned the system earlier, the Bridge system, which is being used by central banks to de-dollarize trade so they can settle trade imbalances between China and other countries. And they're doing that directly through the central banks by using a central bank digital currency, which is a kind of different related technology, which is basically a kind of crypto asset overseen by a central bank, by a government. And also what we've seen is that other countries are experimenting with this as well. So this would be a way of getting around sanctions. And that's why, even though I'm skeptical of Bitcoin specifically, I'm not entirely against the idea of cryptocurrency if it's actually a currency, because this is another way of preventing the U.S. controlled financial system from sanctioning a country and trying to block it from doing trade.
Yeah, no, right on. Thank you for that. If it's cool, only because I do have to start getting ready for my own bedtime here,
Yeah.
and we'll have to reconnect again. Again. So, but if I can, I'd like to sort of collapse. If I can, I'm going to try to formulate a question that involves 3 comments or questions here. So one of the questions is about economic nationalism and the decline of the neoliberal order. Well, one easy question from Yipper here: do you have a Huawei, and how is it?
Yeah, I do.
I guess we could
Very
do
good
that one
phone.
pretty easy. Yeah. Okay. Right on.
Excellent phones. Honestly, I have nothing against Huawei. I think they're a great company, make great technology, but they're actually kind of expensive compared to some other Chinese companies. So I also have a Xiaomi. A Xiaomi is almost identical to Huawei. It's like, Huawei is like top of the line, best of the best. Huawei is like second best. But they're also way cheaper. And in my experience, just
You
as
mean
good.
I'm sorry. What was the second best? What's his name? Because
Xiaomi.
Xiaomi.
Sorry,
Right,
yeah,
right,
Xiaomi
okay,
is like second best. Huawei is top of the line, best of the best. There are actually so many Chinese phone companies that are really, really good. And some of them, like I said, Huawei is amazing. It's top of the line, but it's like it's like the BMW of phones. It's very expensive and top of the notch. You don't need the best of the best. There are some other companies that are really good, like Xiaomi, but then also there are some lesser known Chinese phone companies that are up and coming. One of them is called Honor, and like the word honor in English spelled the same way. And Honor actually was originally part of Huawei, but they actually split off because of the US sanctions on Huawei, and they created like a more budget-friendly version, which is very popular in Latin America, actually. I've seen them a lot, but I haven't really seen them in the US because of, US sanctions and stuff. But there are a lot of new up-and-coming Chinese phone companies that are even cheaper than Huawei that are also very good.
All right, right on. So this is a good way for us to end. Actually, it's something I wanted to get to anyway. And Musa's raising the question here: can you ask about China's supportive approach to Africa and African development? There's a lot of discussion about is China's approach supportive, or is it just a new form of imperialism? But yeah, what is China's? How is China's supporting African development?
Yeah, I would say it's not at all imperialist. This is a misunderstanding of imperialism. Like we look at what European colonialists did to Africa. Not only did they kill millions and millions of people, you see like Belgium killed off half of the population of Congo, killing like 10 million people. I mean, King Leopold was Hitler before Hitler. I mean, Nazism was inspired by European colonialism, right? So what the Europeans did just from the death toll is absolutely insane. But then also economically, look at what the Europeans did in Africa. They left Africa much poorer than it was before they colonized Africa. And look at the infrastructure they built, or the lack thereof. They did not build infrastructure. The only infrastructure they built was like a one port connecting to one railroad going to the mines. And then so they could take the minerals out of the mines, put it on a train, send it to the ports, and export it to Europe. It's the opposite of what China's doing. China has had a very mutually advantageous relationship. Now, obviously, I'm not going to, no one should say that, China's just doing this purely out of benevolence and the good of its heart. I mean, China has this idea, which the Communist Party talks a lot about, which is win-win cooperation or mutually beneficial trade and development. So yes, China does benefit. It gets trading partners, access to markets. It does get resources, but in return, China provides, first of all, top of the line infrastructure across Africa. I mean, so building schools, hospitals, roads, trains, electrical grids, everything. So for instance, South Africa until recently was having a lot of issues with power outages. It was a big issue. China came in and fixed their state-owned power grid. And now I've heard from a lot of friends in South Africa that in the past several months, they have not had any power outages. Those kinds of things that the colonialists never cared about people having power all they cared about was their mines and isolated areas, right? Maybe like a few elite, their political elites, their puppets in whatever the African colony was at the time. So, and then politically, if you look at relations, they're very different. If you listen to what many African leaders are saying, they have a very positive view of China and also Russia, by the way, which is getting less attention. China and Russia are very popular. And there's a famous quote that is often attributed to the former president of Kenya. His name is Kenyatta, but it's not really known exactly who said it. But there's this common quote you hear that is attributed to the former president of Kenya, who said, "Every time a Chinese diplomat visits Africa, we get a new hospital or road or school. Every time a Western diplomat visits, we get a lecture." So, we can see this clearly with the U.S. had this summit recently for African leaders where they were trying to pressure Africa to cut their relations with China. And then all these African leaders were asking the U.S., okay, so what are you going to give us? Like, what infrastructure projects do you want to help us with? And the U.S. didn't have anything. They had this vague idea of like a public-private partnership, blah, blah, blah. If you look at China's infrastructure projects, the vast majority of them in Africa, and not just in Africa, in Latin America, they are building a huge port in Peru, which is opening this week. There's a big a summit of the APEC group, which is like the Asia Pacific Economic Group. So almost all of these projects are being overseen by Chinese state-owned companies. That point is really important. They're not private Chinese companies. Obviously, there are private Chinese companies, but all the infrastructure projects are being overseen by state-owned enterprises, SOEs, that are not being driven by the profit motive. They're an arm of foreign policy, essentially, of China. And China has really prioritized its relations with Africa. Every single year, they have a China-Africa summit. They actually just held it. And it's seen as like one of the most important political events of the year. Like everything in downtown Beijing shuts down. You can't go anywhere downtown. And this year they had over 40 African heads of state who were here in Beijing meeting to talk about, and then they get together. What do they talk about? They talk about trade deals, infrastructure projects, development. And like, this is the most important thing to lift a country out of poverty, right? And like, these countries are doing it in partnership. It's not just like China is doing it on its own. It's like, these are partnerships. So countries are having conditions to lift their own populations out of poverty because, okay, if Africa wants to fight poverty, it needs to industrialize and not only export raw materials, because for hundreds of years, the European colonial powers used Africa as resource colonies. So they colonize Congo. They make one railroad that connects to a port, on the eastern coast, wherever it connected. And then they just suck out all of the wealth. Or, you look at Zimbabwe previously in the colonial era. They suck out all of that. They have lithium and other resources. They suck it all out. They don't develop any industry. Their local economy is entirely built around these extractive industries. If you want to actually develop, how are you going to develop these industries in other parts of the economy? You need really good roads in order to trade with each other, to move products around, to connect your cities together. You need railroads in order to send different products to other parts of Africa. In fact, I recently watched this amazing documentary that was actually about China's relations with Africa in the Mao era. And it was about a railroad they built in Tanzania and in Zambia. And it was fascinating to see that, like, China's relations with Africa really go back deeply into the Mao era when they were really building a lot of infrastructure projects. And there was always solidarity was a big part of it. And obviously the narrative of the Chinese government has changed a little bit. They're not as overtly revolutionary and radical. They've toned that down. They're not as militant. Like, whereas in the Mao era, they were like, fight the imperialists, fight the colonialists. Today, the narrative of China is much more about mutual beneficial win-win development, fighting poverty, South-South cooperation. They don't really use the word imperialism a lot, although that's actually changing in recent years because of the, trade war in the West and such. But the point is that these are the projects that you need to actually industrialize the country. And the last
what is the name? Real quick, what is the name of that documentary? Before, wait, this is the one. Name of the documentary. Do you remember it off the top of your head?
No.
Okay.
Let me look this up really quickly.
Yeah. No problem. And just long. Oh no, somebody's okay. No, yeah, I meant to. I was, thinking I might want to try to catch that myself. But by the way, while
It's
Ben's,
called
yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
yeah, it's called TAZARA is the railroad. If you look up TAZARA stories, TAZARA stories.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
I recently,
Let's see.
yeah, I
Yeah, go
recently
ahead.
saw
Yeah.
this. I went to an event here at Peking University in Beijing, and they had an African scholar who was speaking about from Tanzania, who was speaking about China-Tanzania relations, and they played this documentary.
How do you
I think
spell?
it's available online somewhere.
How do you spell Sarah?
TAZARA,
T-
TAZARA.
All right. TAZARA. Yeah. Okay. Remembering work on a China. Wait a minute. Where? China African Railway Project. All right. Let's see. Okay, no, thank you. Please, I'll find and put a link in the show description, which is where folks can find a link to your website as well. But I'm sorry, I cut you off.
Well,
You were gonna,
sorry to cut you off. I'll add one quick
yeah.
thing, Jared.
Sure.
So if people want to get more information about China-Africa relations, the best group is Tricontinental. If people look up the Tricontinental Institute, and they actually have a lot of team of people on the African continent and multiple countries in South Africa, in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, and Ghana. And they do a lot of really good research. The Tricontinental Institute.
All right,
And they have
great.
so much
Thank
good
you.
information there. And it's called Tricontinental because it's the three continents are Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
Okay, right on. Excellent. Again, I think I cut you off from a point you were going to conclude with. I don't know if you remember where you were headed, but
Yeah, just the point that
yeah.
like for a country to develop, you need really good infrastructure. And China has become the world's best producer of infrastructure and is doing it through its Belt and Road Initiative. And this is so people will say this is imperialist. This is the exact opposite. And I was going to say that even obviously there's this narrative that in the Western media of so-called debt trap diplomacy, which is BS, where they claim that China is trapping countries in debt, which is hilarious. This is exactly what the West has done for decades through the IMF and the World Bank. It's trapped countries in debt. Pakistan is going through its 16th IMF structural adjustment program. 16th. Sri Lanka also. So this is an actual debt trap. Whereas, and you look at countries like Ghana right now, that is paying off so much in debt, or Egypt, which is having an inflation crisis from debt. Or Zambia also is going, or Kenya recently had these big protests against the IMF, right? Because the IMF is imposing these neoliberal programs. So China is helping to create conditions through BRICS, through other organizations that are not as well known, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, that are creating alternatives to the Western-dominated financial institutions. And if you look, China has actually forgiven a lot of debt to not only African countries, but to other developing countries. So the one point I was going to say is that despite all of this propaganda in the West, there are even a few mainstream scholars in the West who have admitted that this whole idea of debt trap diplomacy is false. In fact, there's a very mainstream scholar at Johns Hopkins University, which is, very close to the US government. Her name is Deborah Browdigam, and she's done a lot of research on China's relations with Africa. And she has openly written that this idea of debt trap diplomacy is false. It's not, it's a myth.
Wow. Ben, this has been fantastic. I appreciate you coming through. Definitely want to do this again sooner than later. The link to your work is in the show description. Thank you very much. This has been great. And I apologize for just running out of gas, man. I've just the chat is even making fun of me, talking about I'm about to pass out, and they're not far from the truth. This is an end of a long day, but a perfect end for me. I know it's the beginning for you, and we'll be, tuning into your work. Ben, thank you very much. It's been great. Appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you, Jared. Keep up the great work. I always like seeing your videos, so it's a pleasure being here. We'll keep in
Thank you
touch.
very much. Right on. Definitely. Take care, Ben. Peace, because I know you're willing to fight for it, like Fred Hampton, and we'll catch you later. Thank you very much. All right. All right, everybody. Big thanks again to Ben. Thanks to Kamal for coming through. Thanks to all of you for staying up late with me. And please come on right back tomorrow morning for the Remix Morning Show, and we'll see if I make it. And yeah, again, please like, share, subscribe, do something to support the platform, and definitely appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Peace. Again, only if you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. And we'll catch you next time right here at
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
What do you sacrifice? Calm. Kindness, kinship. Love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago for which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, that set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything, 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 everything.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.